Welcome to this Arnall-Culliford knitwear tutorial. Today's video is all about adding a lifeline to your knitting. Lifeline's a really helpful way to back up your knitting progress. If you're working on a lace project, you can add a lifeline at the end of a repeat, and if you then later make a mistake that you can't fix, you can pull back to that lifeline without having any difficulty picking up your stitches. This video is part of our Something New to Learn About Lace series, and you can find out more about the book and about the beautiful projects in the book over on our website acknitwear.co.uk. This is 2 repeats of the Madeira lace edging on Donna Smith's Aphaca Scarf, 2 stitch repeats that is, and we've worked 1 row repeat of the pattern along with the first row of the next pattern repeat, and it's gone really well. The pattern's all lined up nicely and I'm not aware of any mistakes I've made, so I'd like to back up my knitting by adding a lifeline which will allow me to take my knitting back to this row if I have a problem later on. One of the problems with fixing mistakes in lace is that it can be hard to pick up your stitches again if you drop them and something unravels. Because of the yarn overs and the decreases, it can sometimes be quite difficult to make sure you've got all of your stitches on your needles and you haven't created another mistake when you've pulled back a problem. So I'm working on straight needles, and I've got a tapestry needle here, a nice blunt one, and I've threaded it with a length of mercerized cotton. I have a big ball of this that I use just for waste yarn and lifelines, and it's really good because it's smooth and shiny. It won't stick to my knitting and get it embroiled in things that it shouldn't. It'll come out nice and easily at the end. So because I'm on straight needles, it's going to be quite difficult to thread the tapestry needle through the stitches and pull them through if I leave it on the needle, so I'm actually going to take it off the needles as I go. It just makes it a little bit easier to get each stitch on. And it's literally like we're slipping them onto the waste yarn. Always putting the tapestry needle in purlwise so that the stitches aren't twisted. Another good thing about a lifeline is that if you stick your needle in the same way as the waste yarn was, you never have to worry about whether you've got your stitches mounted the correct way. They will be exactly as you left them. If you've been using stitch markers as you've been knitting, don't thread your lifeline through the stitch marker. If you come to one, remove it, and you can replace it as you knit the next row. But if you put the lifeline through the stitch marker, then the stitch marker will forever stay in your knitting in the lifeline. It'll get caught there. So I've now safely got all of my stitches on my waste yarn, and I'm going to tie the ends of the waste yarn together. Oops. So now that it's tied, the stitches aren't going anywhere, and I'm going to pop them back onto the needles now, ready to work the next row. So the only thing to be careful of is that make sure the stitch that the working yarn is attached to is going to end up at the tip of the needle. So we're going to start threading them onto our straight needles from the opposite end, and we're literally just picking up each stitch so that our needle follows the same path as the waste yarn. When you come to the end stitch, this one's sitting quite nicely, but you do sometimes find that the stitch itself has got pulled or caught, maybe even right through like that. In order to make the stitch pop back up again, just tug on the waste yarn and it will bring the loop of the stitch back through. So you want to make sure you pick up the correct stitch. Oops. Catch that last one. There we go. And we're now ready to work back across our row, and all of the stitches are carefully caught on the lifeline, and we can work on in our knitting, and if a problem arises it'll be easy to pull back to that point, as I'll show you in a minute. If you're working using interchangeable needles like these Knit Pro Symphonies, quite often they have a hole in the barrel that's used for tightening the needle, but that hole in the barrel can also be very handy when you're knitting lace, because you can thread your lifeline through that hole, and then as you work the next row of stitches, it cleverly passes the lifeline through all of the stitches for you without you needing to take them off the needles and put them back on again. Also, if you're working on a circular needle, you can slip the stitches onto the cable, and then it's much easier to pass a tapestry needle through each of the stitches to add a lifeline in that way, without having to slip them off and slip them back on again. So this is another swatch with 2 stitch repeats of the Madeira lace edging from Donna Smith's Aphaca Scarf, and we've put in a lifeline at the end of the first pattern repeat, so all of those stitches are safely secured on the needles, and then we've started working the second pattern repeat, and if you compare it to the first one, you can probably see that we've gone astray a little bit. So we've got a row here where the decreases aren't lining up properly. That one's been worked off a little bit, and the patterning in the lacy bit in the centre isn't lined up neatly the way it should be, and generally things have gone a bit wonky. And the easiest thing to do in this situation, where there are a number of mistakes and there may be quite a few rows back, rather than tinking back, which would be to unknit each stitch individually, we're going to pull back to our lifeline. So you don't need to panic, because all of your stitches down here are secured on the waste yarn. So you simply slide your work off your needles, and you get your ball of wool and you just start pulling it out. Something very therapeutic about it, although it's also a bit depressing if it's something you've worked a long time on and you have to undo all that work. But that's where the lifeline really comes into its own. It saves you from having to pull out the whole thing. You can just take it back to that point when everything was okay. And you'll find when you reach the lifeline that it won't go any further. I can't pull back past the lifeline because all of those stitches are caught on the waste yarn. So I'm just going to deal with my spider's nest of wibbly wobbly yarn. And now we're going to return our stitches to the needles. Again, we need to make sure that the working yarn is attached to the stitch at the tip, although of course when you're on circular needles it doesn't actually matter, because you could start knitting at either end. But just to keep things simple, I'm going to poke my tip through starting at that end. So again, just slip your needle through each of those stitches that are carefully secured on the lifeline. And again, we've rather lost our end stitch, so just pulling down on the waste yarn just lifts that loop up again, and you can pick the last one up. And we've checked, looked at both sides, everything's safely back on the needles. Going to leave the lifeline there. Hopefully we won't need it again, but just in case. And then we can start knitting across the next row in pattern. As required, just ignoring the lifeline, working over the stitches, and hopefully this time completing the pattern repeat without any more hiccups. Thank you for watching our video all about adding lifelines to your lace knitting projects. If you'd like to know more about something new to learn about lace, or about our yarn, or any of our other books and products, do visit our website acknitwear.co.uk. Thanks for watching.